Hey, it's Luminostic in Cuenca, Ecuador. Today we're going to do a video on spiritual intelligence, which is extremely important. When I went through the majority of my process, I didn't really have anyone there to guide me or to give direction. So this is a lot of hard-won wisdom. I hope it benefits everybody. I think it probably will. We're going to get into a little bit about the Phoenix process as well, which I don't think I've talked about yet on this channel. But it's kind of a central experience to, I think, just about anyone that steps foot on the path of initiation will find themselves engaged in the Phoenix process at some point. So do me a favor, take a second to hit the like button, subscribe, share these videos with anyone that may be of service to. Okay, so spiritual intelligence. There's a lot of murky water when you get into spirituality. One of the real purposes behind the intent to evolve spiritually is to become a holistic being. And when I say holistic, I mean holistic in terms of consciousness, which will impact, your physical health and the other layers of being. But fundamentally, we're talking about becoming a conscious unit in the web of consciousness, which means that you should have enhanced powers of precognition, intuition, the interpretation of synchronicities. All of these kind of things are telepathy is another one that I think that we can master and learn to experience outside of, say, ayahuasca ceremonies, and it's not necessarily reserved for people that are just born connected to that part of the intellect. I think this is something that everyone has access to. The problem is, and the reason some like Dennis McKenna theorize, I talk about this all the time, that the idea that there are like filters in the mind that give us this experience of a singular perspective of consciousness, which is totally illusory. If we were constantly bombarded by other people's thoughts, it'd be very difficult to maintain our own train of thought. So we've developed the capacity to kind of screen this stuff out and have our singular perspective. The benefit, however, I'm sure some of you have noticed that the ruling parties all over the planet seem to be a little bit out of control. So if you try to imagine a resistance made of people that are fully telepathic and have that under control, it's very difficult to rule. Also, while we're on the subject, I should mention that, the gnosis is different from a lot of other paths of spirituality. Well, basically, it's the objective in all of them. But what we're doing here is trying to have organic experiences catalyzed by, intent, certain practices. It can be any number of things. But the end result of the gnosis, making it through the Phoenix process without losing your mind, at least not permanently. You have to go out of your head to find your mind, as Timothy Leary said. But the purpose is that we're having an experience that sort of redefines the parameters of what is ethically acceptable, in a way that is not a matter of conforming to rules that are dictated to you. It's just, when you have this experience, you achieve this level of illumination, and suddenly you can be trusted not to steal because you're stealing from yourself and you know it. This is not just some pretty way of, it's like you hear something nice, like we're all one, and it sounds good, all the mystics say it, but in the case of the gnosis, for example, you really actually know this from experience, and that's what, experiences like telepathy, it's one of the major values. Okay, so we have a lot of other stuff to get into, so let's talk about synchronicities a little bit. Carl Jung, the noted psychologist, is the one that coined the term synchronicity. And what he had noticed is that when people were plunged deep into the subconscious, these highly improbable coincidences that were charged with meaning started to happen very rapidly. And the deeper the plunge into the subconscious, the more intense and more frequent these synchronicities. I've experienced them on levels that are just absolutely mind-blowing, and generally when you're walking the path, people tend to try to interpret the synchronicities in order to figure out where to go next, to see what does this mean, and oftentimes that is kind of a pointless endeavor because you're not going to understand until later, and there's a reason for that. It's like the higher mind is trying to demonstrate that it has its own cognition. in ways that you will have certainty and not have to rely on faith that there is a higher power guarding you. So I think it's really important too that once you start to have these experiences of synchronicity, a lot of people have a tendency to start projecting the perception of synchronicity where there's really nothing. And so it's very important to watch out for that. Also, if you are seriously committed to the path to the point where you're going to follow these synchronicities, my advice would be, weigh risk versus benefit. Do not follow. Spirit will have you chasing your tail forever. It's very important not to confuse real signs and symbols and synchronicities with wish demons. And the best safety precaution you can take is just to make sure that you don't pursue anything to the extent that if you're wrong and it's not where you're supposed to go next, you don't do any damage to your own life or anyone else's. It may seem like common sense, but you can really get carried away with this stuff and find yourself overestimating your own power of manifestation. There's another severe warning that I would give. One of the biggest mistakes that the magician makes is to think that his magic can do more for him than it can. And this is extremely common. One of the biggest dangers of walking the path is that your ego will inflate. It's a very common experience, especially for men, to actually get to the point where they actually believe that they are like the highest high God incarnate, specifically you creating all this reality. I think that's an important part of the process because it's not untrue, but it's not exclusively you. And oftentimes when this happens, people won't, you don't listen to anyone around you, you think that you're infallible. The wish demon thing, again, your intuition. You've started to notice that your intuition can actually guide you to things that should be impossible. For myself, like I decided I wanted to talk to Danny Carey, the drummer from Tool, and literally drove right to him. So you do things like this and you're correct 2 times, 3 times, 4 times in a row in really improbable situations. But then all of the things that you want, you start to confuse with true intuition, and that's not how this works. So you have to be very careful not to pursue anything, again, to the extent that you are risking too much. So this ego inflation can happen for a couple of reasons. You think that you're like the most high God because you're manifesting things, you're intuiting things, you're precognizing things, and also because you are manifesting your reality, you can extend that too far and start to believe that you have manifested the entire reality. And it's very difficult because when a person is in this state, they oftentimes will listen to nothing, and humility will serve you well. There are some checks and balances that you can use, like just trying to apply logic. I had a friend recently that, after 2 weeks of using DMT, he decided he was the greatest shaman in the history of the world. And I mean, you just have to think and understand the medicine better than anyone and all of this stuff. And you just have to be able to check yourself and say, like, wait, does that actually make any sense? And the problem is that once you have initiated this phase of the process, it can be very difficult to have any kind of checks and balances. Also, one thing that you can always remember is that you cannot override natural law. There are certain parameters that are dictated to us and not by us, and those are those of natural law. So, if you are trying to manifest something and you have created the proper conduits, there are mechanisms by which these things can occur, then you have a very good chance of succeeding. But if you start to actually believe that you can manifest things that are possible and then act in accordance with this delusion, you can find yourself in a terrible mess. When I receive information, say from ayahuasca or other plants that contain DMT, so far in my experience, every single time it has been correct. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to second guess information that I receive in this way. So speaking of second guessing, another important tactic, and I see a lot of people, this is probably the biggest one that I see people fail with, and that is looking for alternative explanations. Generally, people will fall in love with a certain, with a set of ideas, or something like Wicca or the New Age paradigm, or whatever configurations of ideas that they want to see, they will just sort of force that onto things. A good example is reincarnation. A little while back, there was a kid, maybe 3 or 4 years old, or maybe younger, because his dad was changing his diapers, and the kid started telling his father, I used to change your diapers, and the kid turned out to know all of these things that he couldn't possibly know unless he was actually his own grandfather. And everyone said, okay, well, this is proof of reincarnation. It's not actually proof of reincarnation, because geneticists have proven that ancestral memory is also real, and this was one of his ancestors. So I think it's very important to always look for an alternative explanation, because a lot of people, I think, when they think of spirituality, there's this subconscious decision to allow themselves to become deluded to some degree because they don't actually really fundamentally believe in it. And that is something I think you should really try to absorb. And I don't think it's true. I think there are objective truths in spirituality just as much as there are in the regular material world. It's all reflections of one thing doing one thing, and there are metaphysical mechanisms that are real, and there are other ones that are just ideas that people have. So that's a very good thing to do. Always look for an alternative explanation. Also, it is very important to use what you learn. The most complete set of talents and virtues is wholly useless in the absence of willpower and discipline. If you are told by your higher self that you need to master some habit, that if you stick to meditation throughout the crossing of the abyss that you'll be perfectly safe, and then you don't stick to meditation and you end up losing the golden thread, or the invisible thread as I've called it, this can be disastrous, especially if you've gone way far out there. The idea that he who sticks to meditation is perfectly safe. When you are being inundated, when you have squeegeed your third eye and the stuff is pouring through and you're experiencing intuition that turns out to be accurate, synchronicities are coming in the most extraordinarily unbelievable ways. If you are interested in how intense that can get, check out my synchronicity videos. There's some absolutely absurd stories that were absolutely true. It can become very difficult to stay grounded and to maintain your connection with ordinary everyday reality. The scary part of that is that in many cases you actually need to lose everything material. And I think Crowley said that in the crossing of the abyss, the magician loses all that he has and all that he is in order to be reborn on the other side. So it may be inevitable, but if you're what we call an armchair magician and you don't want to go through that process of complete disintegration, Phoenix process, it implies a crashing and burning before there's any soaring that is going to occur. And this video is kind of geared towards people that are so dedicated to the path of mysticism, esotericism, the occult, whatever it is, that you're actually going to risk a complete breakdown at some point. And I think for most people it's inevitable. When I referred to the Phoenix process earlier, which I'll make another video about, I think it is pretty much the same for everyone. And that's another thing that you have to determine. How far do you want to go? What can you afford to risk? Because order always comes from chaos. So there's like this process of like a chaotic meltdown before this new self emerges. There may be exceptions to this, but I've not seen it yet. It does seem pretty consistent. So you must use what you've learned. If you receive all of these revelations and you just forget about them and go on about your life as if none of it happened, obviously no good will come of that. And as you progress, if you don't use the things that you've learned on the way, you're going to have a harder and harder time because there's a reason that you're learning these things. He who sticks to meditation is perfectly safe is a very sound piece of advice, and you just have to implement it in order to benefit from it. I also wanted to mention that some of these old mythologies have things to teach us. The God and Satan dichotomy from Christianity, for example, is sort of a metaphor for these two opposing forces that are the foundation of existence. And we and everything else are microcosms, holographic reflections of the all, which is consciousness. They're symbolized in the mystery schools as three pillars in the Hermetic Masonic tradition: the darkness on the left and the light on the right. And we, as these human beings, are the middle pillar, trying to harmonize these forces. And I would also say that the realm of existence, the dimension that we exist in, is the product of the harmonization of these two forces. And so it's basically our job to become conscious that we are transmuting this energy and to direct the effects and the things that are generated from the transmutation of this energy. This is what is really meant by terms like manifestation. This is what you were doing. As this consciousness passes through you, you are using the more subtle aspects of mind in order to shape the experience for yourself and for others. So it's important to remember that the way to mastery is to break all the rules. But you must know the rules perfectly before you're in a position to transcend them. And so this learning to balance an open mind with skepticism, to maintain discernment, to willing to be objective when you have an idea that you've fallen in love with. The most unforgivable sin is to fear knowledge, lest it not pander to thy prejudices, right? I mean, if you really are on a quest for truth and not just like delusions that you're comfortable and happy with, then you have to have a sort of objectivity. And I think that, I see a lot of failure with this in the spiritual community, where people just, they like an idea, they want to believe that something is channeled, and rather than actually looking at it and saying, is there any reason to think that anything in this book has come from a higher being and is not just some stuff that some person thought, and this author was too insecure to say, these are my ideas, and felt like they needed to predicate the importance of it on, having come from some higher being. I mean, I do personally believe that there are beings of that nature that we can communicate with. I believe I've done it myself. I've received information about star systems that were not known to the rest of humanity that turned out to be entirely true, down to the most minute detail. It's in Ayahuasca and the Star Tribes, another video, if you watch that. But I will say that even having interacted with them, there's not really a whole lot that, what is another being on another planet really going to tell you that a human can't think of anyways, we don't even have the fundamentals down. So channeling higher dimensional knowledge is not necessarily going to do us a whole lot of good. I mean, you look at a place like Shasta in Northern California, where everyone's channeling all this stuff supposedly from these higher dimensional beings, and yet no one has really come up with anything groundbreaking or, no new alien technologies. There's absolutely no evidence really that any of it is legitimate, and I think people just believe it because they want to, which also I think is an obstruction to receiving genuine information of that kind. Also, I can tell you from personal experience that knowledge from higher dimensions generally cannot be communicated very effectively with language. That's why these things exist in other dimensions. We don't have language for things that we have not perceived yet. And, it's relatively new, at least in the modern experience, for people to go to these dimensions and make these observations. And so eventually we may develop a set of symbols or some, reestablish our telepathic abilities so that we can communicate them directly to each other. But for the most part now, if you're reading channeled material, it's not from a higher dimension. If it was, you couldn't read it and understand it. I hope that makes sense. So, I hope this has been of benefit. If you guys have any more questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments section below. Like, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon. Thank you very much for watching.